Revolution Radio proudly presents, live from the heart of the Blue Ridge, Roanoke, Virginia. It's the Just Bernard Show with host Bernard Alvarez. Join Bernard as he shares topics that reveal the real matrix and empower your human experience, including world liberty, the esoteric, suppressed technologies, spiritual ascension, and human consciousness. Humanity has awakened, and our time has come to realize our full potential. And now, live from the Star City, your host, Bernard Alvarez.
So without further ado, let me tell you a little bit about Colleen Mauro. She is the author of Spiritual Telepathy, Ancient Techniques to Access the Wisdom of the Soul. She is the founder and a former editor-in-chief of Intuition magazine. In this new book, she introduces techniques and knowledge, a body of knowledge that is called the Ageless Wisdom, called the Esoteric or Mystery Teachings. This wisdom was first put into book form by the Hindu sage Patanjali in his classic book, the Yoga Sutras, another one of our favorite topics to speak about here on the show. For her book, Colleen draws on a variety of cultures and spiritual traditions, both ancient and modern, and explains how the new science validates these ancient teachings. She shares her own experiences and introduces readers to others who have also used these practices. So welcome to the show, Colleen. It's so nice to have you here today.
Thank you for having me.
And Colleen, so is this the first book that you've put out?
It is.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. And I know of Intuition magazine, so thank you for being a part of bringing that forward to the world.
I love doing it, and I really see that the subject of this book is really the next step, the next higher level. And I was very intrigued and spent years studying this subject because I could see how important it was and how timely it was that we can take that next step now.
Wonderful, wonderful. And in reference to bringing this book about, and you mentioned it a little bit, well, the title of the book is Spiritual Telepathy. What did you mean by using that term, spiritual telepathy? I would think it would mean different things to different people, but for you, what did that mean, and how do you define it?
Well, it's part of the Ageless Wisdom teachings. Spiritual telepathy is communication from the subtle worlds, from our souls, or from higher beings. And communication from this level is always telepathic. We usually don't audibly hear the information. It's just dropped into our brains where it's formulated into thought.
Oh, wonderful. So it's very similar to what many of us talk about, having spiritual downloads, kind of. Is
Correct.
that what you mean?
Correct. Absolutely.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I love that term, too.
And it does seem to be a part of that, what I call the awakening process. I feel it is very important for us to begin to have that relationship with, whether it be our higher self or our source wisdom, and begin to receive these messages, kind of exactly what you're explaining about in spiritual telepathy. What is it that, what is the main premise of spiritual telepathy? What are people going to learn by reading this book?
Well, the book provides both the theory and a step-by-step mind training practices that will allow readers to make that direct contact with the soul, and through the soul to even higher worlds. I've always been very touched and even envious when I have read about people who have the ability to communicate with the higher worlds. Joan of Arc, for example, talked to saints and angels. Eileen Caddy received guidance that led to the founding of the Findhorn community in Scotland. And the botanist George Washington Carver walked in the woods each morning to talk to God. And apparently God talked back. He called it the divine radio. And it's always stirred such a longing in me, and I've always wondered, is it only special people more involved than the rest of us who can have these experiences? Or is it somehow preordained, or do we have to move into a monastery and devote our lives to this kind of practice to have these experiences? But as I immersed myself in this topic, it became clear that with the proper training, we can all cultivate this ability.
So it's available to anybody, actually, is what you're saying.
Correct. Correct.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. And there seems to be so many words that are being thrown around these days. Some people call it, well, spiritual telepathy is a great term, connecting with the higher self, source consciousness, out of body experience, connecting with your angels, connecting with your spirit guides. Um, and in your and the way that you approach it, what are the different types of telepathy?
Well, there's three types of telepathy, and I went over that in the book, and that's a very interesting teaching. The lowest is instinctual or feeling-based telepathy, and we share this type of telepathy with the animal kingdom. The second is mental or mind-to-mind telepathy, and then the highest is spiritual or soul-to-soul telepathy. And the teaching is very interesting because it illustrates the progression of our perceptual abilities from the instinct of early man to the intellect of modern man to the pure intuitive knowing of future man. And we're right at that doorway where we can take that step. We can move from the physical world into the subtle superhuman worlds. And that's an evolutionary step where the subtle worlds then become part of our human world.
And so, do you feel that we're going through that at this time in humanity's evolution, that we're getting ready to take that next evolutionary jump?
I think we can. I think through the evolutionary process, everybody will make that shift over time, over a long period of time, but it's possible to speed it up. And we can undergo this mind training process that will allow us to make that leap right now. And many people feel called to do this right now, to be leaders or somehow to participate in this coming shift. So we can speed up the process.
Wonderful. And what are some of the ways that you offer for us to be able to speed up the process? Are there certain meditation techniques or diet or practices, or what do you see?
Well, the main tool is the daily practice of what we call creative meditation. And most meditation practices focus only on quieting the mind.
Hmm.
In this type of meditation, we go a step further, and we actively train our minds to transmit information from the soul to the brain. The information has to reach the brain to become part of our conscious awareness. And it's in the same way that our homes are wired for telephone and internet connection. This type of meditation allows us to create the threads and cables that link us to the higher worlds. Excuse me. And we create these cables by projecting our attention upward to the soul day after day. We visualize the soul as a star about 6 inches above our head. And as we do this every day, we anchor small threads of energy that will eventually, thread by thread, form a symbolic bridge between the mind, the brain, and the soul. This bridge is called the Rainbow Bridge or the Bridge of Light in the Wisdom Teachings. It's called the Antakarana in the Hindu text, and it's called the Straight or Narrow Gate in the New Testament. When I researched the subject, I discovered that this teaching really forms the core of all of our spiritual traditions. So it's everywhere.
Yes, it certainly is, and I love it because it reminds me. Right now, there's a lot of discussion as well on oh gosh, what's the word I'm thinking of um, oh, forgive me, I'm at a loss for words, but it's a technique where we are reprogramming our mind, oh Jesus, where we reprogram pathways within our own mind, but as well as reprogramming pathways within our mind, what you're describing is creating pathways from the consciousness to our higher consciousness, perhaps.
Correct, correct. It's an alignment with the soul, excuse me, the soul, the mind, and the brain. And when we do this type of mind training, the brain actually becomes a conduit for information from the soul to reach the brain. And again, it has to reach the brain to become part of our conscious awareness. So as we create this bridge day after day, we're creating this alignment. And when we do this, then we have the ability to contact the higher self at will. It's said that as we approach the soul, we increasingly come under the influence of its higher vibration, and our own vibratory rate starts to speed up. And when the vibratory rate of the mind and brain matches that of the soul, it becomes possible to enter the higher worlds at will. And it's our repeated contact with those higher worlds that will, in the end, produce a new kind of human, the soul-aligned human being. And it's then that we become pioneers as we lead the way from one stage of our human development to the next. Again, from the human to the superhuman.
I love it, and it's wonderful because we are seeing more and more people, at least in the work that I'm doing and the work that I'm seeing on the internet and around the world on social media. We're just seeing so many people that are are not only interested in it, but are trying to get this message across to humanity that this is the next step. It is possible for all of us to have this ability within us, and I agree that it is definitely our next evolutionary step. Um, uh, Coming from another perspective, do you feel that there's a reason why this wasn't taught to us when we were younger, or why this wasn't a part of our being when we were born? Is there some reason why this isn't readily available when we, show up on this plane of consciousness?
Well, we're all born with this ability, and it's activated slowly through the evolutionary process, and people develop it at different rates. Through the evolutionary process, we've developed the physical body, the emotional body, the mental body, and it's said that the rational mind is the highest point of the human experience, and so now we can take that step beyond. And it's a training that we have to undergo, sort of a forcing process. Again, it'll happen to everybody slowly over time, but we can speed it up. And I think that it's so important now because we're so under the gun. When we make conscious contact with the soul, everything changes. We lose our sense of separateness and realize that we're part of one great life, the soul of humanity. And it's then that we experience our interconnection with everyone and everything. And you can imagine how the world would change if a critical mass of people made the shift. Barbara Marx Hubbard has written that those of us on Earth today are the crossover generation, that we're responsible for leading the way from one stage of our species evolution to the next. And Eckhart Tolle talks about this too, but in more stark terms. He has written that as a species, we have the choice now to evolve or die. They both say that evolution happens as a result of some sort of crisis that propels or forces us to make a leap forward. Toll uses the example of an amphibian who's forced to develop the ability to live on land after its habitat dries up. And our own habitat is in trouble now, and we're faced with that same need now. Our world is full of conflict. We have weapons that can easily extinguish the human race. So we need to make that next step. We need to make that leap, not onto land, but into the subtle worlds.
Yes, yes, here, I agree. Um, Now, coming from your work with Intuition, the magazine Intuition, how does this book relate to the work that you've done with Intuition?
Well, I see it as a next step. It's a higher level of spiritual perception. Our human intuition tells us about our personal lives, our work, our relationships, and so on. But spiritual telepathy allows us to make direct contact with the soul, and the soul knows our higher purpose. This is a higher level of intuitive perception that can guide our lives. The soul is the purest and most reliable source of direction and guidance.
I couldn't agree more. And with that being said, I need to ask you, Colleen. I feel, and I work with many people around the world that are going through this very same experience, that not only is this evolutionary step done through work and practices and whatnot, but there seems to be thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of people that are experiencing this evolutionary leap spontaneously without any um, forcing or training or anything like that. I'm approached by literally hundreds and maybe over thousands over the last 10 years of people feeling that they're going crazy, that they're having they're having quote unquote downloads, and all of a sudden, their intuition it has become more refined, or they become having more psychic ability, or they're having feeling more connection with the energy and the world, the subtle world, as we had mentioned. Uh, what is your take on this spontaneous aspect of what's happening?
I do think it happens spontaneously, and I had an experience that actually led to the creation of Intuition magazine. But the point of this book is that we can train ourselves to access this information at will. We don't have to wait for it to suddenly happen to us, that there is a way that we can have this connection every day, all day. We can make this connection whenever we need to.
Yes, and that's definitely the goal. Absolutely,
Hmm.
I would think.
Hmm.
And where's this going to take us once we have moved into this evolutionary, and once we've stepped through the evolutionary portal, so to speak? Where is this going to take humanity?
Well, again, it comes back to losing what the Buddhists call the great heresy of separation, that we understand that we're all interconnected. So you can imagine how the world would change. It would be hard to declare war if we realized that we're each a part of the other. It'd be like declaring a war on ourselves. So it changes everything. We start to look at working for the greater good rather than our own personal needs. It sort of moves us up from the lower chakra, so to speak, to the higher, where we realize that we're part of the universal life. That we lose our personal ambition and start to work for the greater good. That's what I'm finding in my own experience, that it's not so important to me now to accomplish this or that. It's being able to be of service and working for the greater good that really is the motivator.
Absolutely. And is it fair to say that you're experiencing this now? You get to feel that connection, that push, that intuitive process throughout your working day?
Absolutely. It's made a huge, huge difference in my life. And there's a piece of this, sort of a preliminary piece of this that I'd like to talk about. And
Yes.
that what I've been through with that is, I think, important for people. It's said that the first step in esoteric training is the refinement of our physical, emotional, and mental bodies, the lower bodies. And this is important because we need to create a direct line of communication between the soul, the mind, and the brain. And to do this, we have to purify the lower bodies so that we have a direct contact from the soul to the brain. If we have an illness, if we're tired, or especially if we have mental or emotional static, it makes it hard for our brains to register the higher ideas. It actually repels them. And what I've discovered is that these refinement practices are part of all spiritual traditions, and the methods vary from tradition to tradition, but the goals and requirements are exactly the same: purity of body, control of the emotions, and stability of mind. And I devoted an entire chapter to this. And in the book, I included the refinement practices that have helped me the most, the practice of harmlessness, the nightly review, and meditations on loving kindness, forgiveness, and compassion. What I discovered when I got really serious about quieting myself down and really having a disciplined practice was that the quieter I got, the more old emotional stuff started to bubble up. And Jack Kornfield has talked about this a lot. When he started teaching meditation, he discovered that at least half of his students were unable to master the basic concentration exercises because they had so many unresolved emotional issues. And he's been a pioneer in bringing Western therapeutic practices into Eastern spiritual practices. And I found that I needed this kind of work too, and it surprised me because I had done a lot of therapeutic work in my younger years. But I started to work with a spiritual healer named Stephen Lumiere, and he gave me a prescription, so to speak, of the three meditations: forgiveness, loving kindness, and compassion. I really had a hard time with the forgiveness piece, and that's what kept bubbling up for me. And so he had me do them morning, noon, and night. And so I did this over an extended period, and I really experienced this refinement practice, that I was able to forgive people. I became much more tolerant. My heart started to open. So that, combined with a daily exposure to this soul light, really has made a huge, huge difference in my life. I have so much more peace and joy, so much more tolerance and compassion for people. It's really changed my relationships tremendously.
Wonderful, wonderful. That's where we all want to be, I would hope.
Mhm. Mhm.
What do you say? And I love the fact that you're bringing up this mental and emotional static that does kind of, I don't know if you want to say it weighs us down or it keeps our vibration lower, but we seem to live in a society where we are trained to either ignore it or to pop a pill or to get over it or shake it off. That seems to be very, you hear it in school. You bump your knee or something. Oh, just walk it off. And the same thing seems to happen with emotional crises within our life. That our society has kind of made it almost an embarrassment to feel any emotion in today's modern world, and we see this through the symptom of so much antidepressants that are being used and all these pills and distractions that are being offered to us. I call the cakes and circuses, I call them. And what where does someone find the courage to face this mental and emotional static that needs to be worked through? And I agree with you very much because even throughout my practice, I've been on a spiritual path for several decades now, and to this day, I'm still things bubbling up to the surface that I may have completely forgotten, and I feel okay. Well, now I need to work through this, and it's definitely an ongoing process for those of us on the path. but just to have the courage, to have the drive and the motivation to work through that. Where can people find that courage?
Well, I think what happens is that we get a little taste of this soul contact and we want more. I was surprised at how quickly I started to feel a connection to my soul. And somehow I thought that that was an experience that only people more evolved than I was would have, or people that lived in monasteries or something. This practice is very scientific. If we do A and B, we're going to experience C sooner or later. So having this soul contact really motivates us. And I wanted that more and more. And so when you sit down and you find that you have these blocks, you do what you have to do to resolve the issue. You have an experience and you want more of it. That's the motivator. That was the motivator in my life, and I think that's a very universal experience.
Very well said, and I agree. Wonderful. Um, you talk about a concept called the everyday genius. What is the everyday genius?
Well, that's something that I really enjoy talking about. It was very interesting to study this topic, and I thought very carefully about how I wanted to present it. But I didn't want to just present the esoteric context, that I wanted to show people that it was part of all of our spiritual traditions, that it was part of our scientific, our quantum scientific theory, and that many of the people that we experience as geniuses have had this experience. And the wisdom teachings tell us that the soul is the portal or gateway to the higher worlds, that when we make contact with the soul, we have access to the universal or divine mind, the storehouse of all wisdom and knowledge. One of my favorite books was Higher Creativity, and it was written by the late Willis Harman, who was the former president of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And in this book, he looked at the biographies of many artists, writers, composers, scientists, and inventors, and discovered that their greatest achievements came through an intuitive breakthrough. And I read this book again before I started my book, and I went to the bibliography and started looking at his original sources. And what I discovered when I read the full text of the interviews is that many of the people that we call geniuses talked about their creative process in exactly the way it's explained in the wisdom teachings, that it's through the soul that they had access to a universal flow of information and inspiration. There was one great book called Talks with Great Composers. It was written in the late 1800s by an American living in Europe. And he interviewed Puccini, Brahms, Strauss, Wagner, and other well-known composers about the source of their creative genius. And it was fascinating to read these interviews because their experience was so consistent. Each of them spoke of the soul as the portal to a universal source of inspiration. And once they connected to the source, the ideas and images simply flowed into their brains. And I put many of these stories in the book. And it became clear at that point that genius is not a rare and random event, but an experience that each of us can cultivate. And Albert Einstein talked about this a lot. He talked about his knowledge and discoveries coming from a higher source. He has said there comes a time when the mind takes a higher plane of knowledge, that all great discoveries have involved such a leap, and that the mystical is the source of all true art and science. And it's interesting that after he died, researchers dissected his brain, trying to understand the source of his genius. Why was he smarter than everyone else? And he probably thought that was hilarious because the brain is simply the receiving plate. It's not the generator of the experience. And it makes sense that they would study that because it's the only tangible thing that they can study, but it doesn't come from the brain. It comes from the higher worlds, and it's dropped down into our brains. Again, the brain is just the receiver.
Yes, yes, definitely. Um, well, that sounds absolutely wonderful, and I have so many more questions to ask you, Colleen. We're going to be coming up on a break in just probably about 30 seconds or so. So before we go on break, could you please share with everybody where we can find your book, Spiritual Telepathy?
It's on Amazon, and you can go to my website, which is spiritualtelepathy.net, and read the introduction. There's back issues of Intuition magazine, and there's many links throughout the site directly to Amazon.
Oh, great, great. Thank you. And with that being said, I just want to remind everybody that next week we are going to be doing our monthly consciousness talk. And I have some very, very exciting guests coming through the end of the year. I've got the holiday lineup all set up, and we've got some great shows coming up.
And now, back to your host, Bernard Alvarez.
And welcome back to the Just Bernard Show here on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Today we were speaking with the author of the new book, Spiritual Telepathy. Colleen Mauro is joining us live. Colleen, let me ask you, I've been doing, I guess we can call it the higher self work, having that communication with my higher self for a couple decades now. And I'm wondering for the layperson that's listening, someone who has not yet made that connection or is just now starting to make that connection, uh, w- due to our past spiritual upbringing, depending on where we're born, what part of the world we're born, different religious background and whatnot. What do you feel we are connecting to when we say we're connecting to this higher self or getting this information? Where is this? What is the source of this information?
Well, the source of information is our individual soul, which each of us have. And again, the soul is the portal then to the even higher worlds, where there is a universal or divine mind, which is the source of all information. But the first step is really making that contact to our individual souls, our higher selves.
Ah, I see. I see. And for those out there, and I know there are many throughout the world that do this practice, what about channeling or channeling the archangels or channeling transdimensional beings? What is their role, and where does that fit into what we're talking about here?
Well, that's a really good question because this work actually makes that kind of channeling obsolete because we don't need a middleman, so to speak. We don't need to connect with higher beings that can then give us the information. We can go direct. We can train ourselves to access this information ourselves. And our minds actually become our own individual search engine. They extend out into the cosmos. They can gather information and then download that information directly into our brains. So we don't need mediums. We don't really need to hook into any particular being that can give us the information. We can develop this ability ourselves.
I love that answer. Thank you for clarifying that. I was waiting for someone on the show to say that for years now. Yes, I couldn't agree more. And what comes to mind in this aspect of our discussion, I believe it's mythographer Joseph Campbell. He said, I don't need religious faith. I have experience. And
Exactly.
I love those words, and I've lived by those words since I've heard them, geez, 30 years ago when he said them. And I really agree with what you're saying there. But is it fair to say that there's a place for that? Is it a part of the process of having beings intercede, or do you find that to be an obstacle and a distraction?
No, I think it's part of the process. And when I thought about the way one teaching sort of is developed upon the other, I realized that in my adult life, I've seen this progression. It seems to move by decades. In the 70s, psychism was a big thing,
Right.
and we were all, direct dialing our psychics for information. There was psychic schools and trainings and so on. And in the 80s, channeling was a really big thing. And then in the 90s, it was intuition. And then after the turn of the century, a lot of the science books came out talking about the extended mind, and the information about Stargate, the military program, was released. And
Hmm.
now I think there's an even higher level that we can experience, and that's that direct intuitive information, that direct intuitive connection. Essentially, it's vertical rather than horizontal. Any kind of psychism or basic clairvoyance, we're getting information from the physical plane. I consider it sort of a horizontal perception, but we can train our minds to work vertically, so then we can move beyond the physical plane into the higher worlds. And it's a really important step, and the people that do this can serve as intermediaries between the physical and the spiritual worlds. It's said that the masters who guide the evolution of our planet cannot directly affect life on Earth. They look for those of us who have that direct line of communication between the soul and the brain, and information and ideas can then be stepped down via the soul and impressed upon our brains. And we can essentially function as the arms and legs of God because we have this information, we bring it down, and imagine what the world would be like if more and more people could do this.
Definitely, definitely. Yes, yes. And speaking of which, and as we are evolving, as today's neuroscience and other scientific disciplines are starting to get the picture. And I remember, geez, my book came out recently in the last 5 years, but when I wrote it, the information I was getting was that science can never really discover the divine, for lack of a better term. I mean, they're getting really close, but
Hmm.
it was almost as if the messages I was receiving were saying, kind of like that story. Once you put a label on it, it's no longer what it is. You know, you've changed it. It's been the divine has changed once the ego begins to interpret it. But I will say that, between quantum physics and other, advanced scientific disciplines, we are starting to see a little bit of connection. What are your thoughts on perhaps, like quantum physics and what we're talking about here today? Are they starting to overlap? Are you seeing a little bit of a connection there?
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, one of the things I wanted to do with this book was to broaden out the audience. I thought a lot about the science books on the extended mind and how widely they're circulated and how people appreciate them. These are New York Times bestsellers, Lynn McTaggart's books and Rupert Sheldrake and Dean Radin and so on. So the scientific aspect of this is widely embraced, but the actual esoteric practices still seem to be geared to a select audience. And I think they're still somewhat suspect in the wider world because they can't be validated at this stage scientifically in that same way. But what I discovered, especially reading about the early pioneers of quantum theory, is that when you take out the names and just put what they said, you could be reading the same information in an esoteric book. In the esoteric tradition, we're told that we have an etheric or energy body that surrounds the physical body. It's called the golden bowl in the Bible. And this etheric body forms a part of a universal ether that connects us to everyone and everything. And it's through the etheric body that we receive and transmit telepathic information. And it's easy to understand then how we can be affected by thought currents, by distant healing, even the movement of the planets above us when we realize that we're connected to everyone and everything. And many of the pioneers of quantum science talked about this underlying web. When they investigated matter at the subatomic level, they discovered to their surprise that it wasn't solid or separate. It was interconnected particles that seemed capable of exchanging information across space and time. And so they talked about this underlying energetic web. They called it a mind-like sea of energy or an information field. David Bohm talked about a mind-like quality that's present in every particle. And as we go to subtler levels, it becomes stronger and more developed. Schrodinger talked about the mind being non-local. He was the first to use that term, I think.
Yeah.
And our contemporary scientists like Dean Radin in his book Entangled Minds, he talks about how our brains and mind are in intimate communion with the rest of the universe. He talks about it as though we live in a gigantic bowl of jello, and every wiggle, every movement, every thought is felt throughout the entire bowl. So essentially they're talking in scientific terms about the same thing that we can read in esoteric books, that we're all interconnected. There's a mind-like field of energy that we're all available for this universal or divine mind.
One.
Sheldrake calls it the morphic field, and he came up with that
Yes.
theory in the 80s.
Yes.
So
Yes.
they're saying the same things. And again, you take away the names and you think that you're reading, quotes from an esoteric book. So they are overlapping, and it's an exciting time to be alive.
Yes, it is, isn't it? It really, truly, truly is. We were so lucky, actually. We had Rupert Sheldrake on the show probably about this time last year, and what a fascinating discussion that was, as well as this one is on this particular topic. And with that being said, what about religion? Many people want to hold on to their religious beliefs. Is there a place for these type of techniques in, let's say, Buddhism or Christianity or in Islam? Would someone who wants to align with that type of religion, would they be able uh, to do this work without feeling any type of, cognitive dissonance or anything?
Sure. I mean, if you really study, and I sort of decided to be a detective. Again, I wanted to show that this is just not woo-woo, new agey, esoteric stuff, but that it's the core teaching that exists at the heart of all religions. So I really hit the books, and I looked for the parallels, and I found them everywhere. It's in Hinduism, it's in Buddhism, it's in Esoteric Christianity, it's in the Kabbalah, it's in Sufism. It tends to show up more in the esoteric practices. You know, there's an exoteric practice, and then there's the higher inner esoteric practices.
Right.
That's where you find it. I loved reading the Gnostic Gospels in particular because the mystic Christian path really was the path that felt like home to me.
Hmm.
And so I read a lot of those books. I read all the Gospels, and I just absolutely fell in love with this information. Then I went back and read the New Testament, and I saw how much information is actually there. It's kind of buried. It's symbolic, but it's there. And so we have our own esoteric teachings. We don't necessarily need to embrace Eastern traditions. For me, it felt too foreign, and I was so happy to have found esoteric Christianity. But it's all there. It's very fascinating to study this subject.
Oh, well, that's good. Very, very good. And as well, let me ask you, for those who are just getting involved in this, what would you think would be the first step? Besides, of course, buying the book and reading the book, what would you prescribe, so to speak, as the first step for someone to begin this intuitive connection with their soul?
Well, there's 12 meditations in the book
Oh,
and additional practices. What I wanted to do was make it very how-to and step-by-step. And so there, in addition to the practices, the refinement practices that were so important to me, I included 3 mind training practices that develop one upon the other. So I would encourage them to do the first basic practice, just a mind control practice. When we start to be able to control the mind, we then are quieting the mind enough that we can get this information, and we can use the mind as a tool that allows us to explore the higher worlds. It becomes our servant rather than our master. So mind training, mind control is the first step, and that's the first step in every spiritual tradition.
yes, yes, and it seems to be the common, I guess, the common complaint of those starting out is that they can't quiet their mind, the monkey
Hmm.
mind, as we say,
Right, right.
and it can be easy, but it does come with practice.
Absolutely. It's really a daily practice, and that's what I discovered. Because it's a subtle process of building this connection to the higher worlds, if we stop, then it starts to dissipate. So it's really a daily practice.
Yeah, yeah.
And in ancient times, these practices were taught in mystery schools, and they were given only to a select group of people that were deemed to be ready. But in our current age, it's really self-imposed. We decide if we're ready and willing to do this daily practice.
Yes, I agree, and I do believe that the information, uh, well, especially now with technology, but because of where we are in today's world, how important it is for this information to be made available to every single person,
Mhm.
and not
Mhm.
just the spiritual elite or whatnot. And so, if if we are connecting with our soul, if our soul is connecting with the source of all creation, does this clarify? Um, Well, I'm trying to bring in the Akashic records here. Are the Akashic records any part of this connection that we're talking about?
Yeah, that's information from the subtle worlds. But it said that we can go actually even higher,
Hmm.
where all information past, present, and future is available.
Yes. Okay.
And
And
that's really exciting to me because, again, it's not just for special people. It's for all of us and any of us. And those of us who undertake this discipline can play a very exciting and leadership role in bringing in this new consciousness. You can imagine all the beauty and all the great information that we could bring in if we can access this universal mind.
I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. Now, does this work? And I don't know if you mentioned this in your book or not, but the concept of death, of leaving this body, moving into the etheric field, so to speak, does this practice help prepare us for that? And does our work continue when we leave this body, and once we get on this path?
Well, I would say, yeah, the term is continuity of consciousness. When we can make direct contact with the soul, we realize that the soul is eternal. The soul is with us through each and every lifetime. So when we make this contact, we then can be conscious on the other side of all of our lives. And at some point, we become conscious in our physical lives of the other lives that we led.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And now, Colleen, with everything that we've spoken of, the one thing that and I don't know if this is even possible to put into worldly terms, so to speak. As we connect, the idea that much of our life is an illusion, and I don't want to get too Eastern esoteric, but a lot of it is created through ego, a lot of it is created through our intentions and our perceptions. And as we evolve into that place beyond the illusion, um, does this connection to the soul, does this connection to the source information help us to transcend that illusion mind, so to speak? Is that what one of the pluses of doing this?
Yeah, actually, we start to move our energy up from the lower chakras. This teaching relates to the Eastern tradition of the chakras. That our lower chakras, the first three, have to do with our personal earth lives, and the chakras above have to do with the universal spiritual life. And we're right at that point where we're moving from the third chakra to the fourth, the heart chakra. And the heart chakra really is the borderline between the physical and spiritual worlds. That when we start to open that chakra, that's when we become universal and we start stepping into that higher world and that higher consciousness. And everything in our lives change.
Ap- Oh yeah.
And there,
Uh,
you can see that there's a lot of focus on the heart right now with heart math and, all the scientific stuff that's coming out. There was just a new documentary on the heart. I mean, it's everywhere. And it's because we're right at that doorway.
Absolutely, absolutely, and even my higher self connection says is constantly reminding me to think from the heart, which is
Hmm.
a fairly new concept, I would think. But to have that heart consciousness is kind of where we're at. So I definitely can see where that aligns with that. Um, what is your take on the idea that that this world is a world for to learn this stuff, that this is a school? Are we here to evolve? Are we here to make the world a better place? Well, what's the meaning of life, for lack of a better term?
Well, it's said that we're all sparkled of divine, and we come down to this earth plane to develop the ability to then transform earth and become divine again. So it's a series of lifetimes. And when we start this process of making contact with the soul, we're towards the end of that process. So it's through our experiences that we work through many of these issues that can relate to the lower chakras and become more spiritualized and aware of the soul, and then eventually we make direct contact, and the soul takes over the body. The body rather becomes the vehicle for the soul on Earth, and it's at that point that we come back just to do service. The Tibetan Buddhist theory talks about this a lot. That when our evolution is complete, we don't depart this Earth, but we come back to serve until all beings are enlightened.
Yes, and I vaguely remember saying that to myself and saying I'm not doing that again. No, but
But what's important about this, I think, is that we don't do this work for ourselves. We do this work for the greater good. Because you
yes.
can imagine how each person that makes this connection makes it easier for those that follow. If we're all cells in the body of God, when one cell lights up, it creates a magnetic pool that makes it easier for other cells. And as more and more cells light up, it becomes stronger and even easier. So we're working for the greater good, not just for our own individual experience.
Yeah. And service to others.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely. For those that are starting to make a connection, and I get this a lot because I do spiritual counseling, and the question that many of them say to me are, well, how do I know it's working? Or how do I need proof that it's working? And a lot of times I do laugh. I'm like, well, that's just your ego saying, prove it. But
Mhm.
are there signs that people can tell that they're making progress? Are there symptoms of the shift, so to speak, that you've identified?
Yeah, I have. And it's kind of hard to put it into words because it's more of a feeling.
Hmm.
One thing that I've noticed is that I've kind of shifted into a higher flow. In my life, the main things that I have accomplished have come about through strength of will. That when I want to make something happen, I go about it almost with military precision, where I do manifesting exercises and I'm sort of relentlessly focused on it until I make it happen. And I think that's a very much a third chakra kind of experience. And what I've discovered is that recently things come to me. For example, when I was finishing the book, an opportunity just dropped right into my lap, which was the perfect thing at the perfect time with the perfect people. And I remember marveling about this. I thought, wow, I didn't do anything to make this happen. So we get into this higher flow where we attract what we need, and we don't need to sort of go about it in that ego-oriented, driven, ambitious way that I and most of us really operate. We can shift into a higher flow where things come to us,
I
and it's
love.
an experience too of just being in this more expanded sense of our heart opening, of changing the way we look at the world and changing the way we look at other people. I'm a lot more tolerant and understanding, less judgmental. It's very subtle, but
Yeah.
when you experience it, it's very real.
Yes. Yes. And we're coming up on the end of the program. I can't believe how quickly this hour went by with you, and I want to thank you very much. Colleen, if you had one message for the entire human race, what would you like to share with them?
That this experience is not just for special people, it's for all of us. And the world very much needs us. The world needs us to have this higher flow, to bring in higher levels of information, that we are in a crisis point and that we need this shift in consciousness.
Thank you. And again, I couldn't agree more with that, with what you said. That's absolutely wonderful. And it was such a pleasure having you on. For everybody listening, you can find more information at spiritualtelepathy.net. As well, you're on Facebook, Colleen?
I am. I am.
Wonderful. So it's facebook.com, Colleen dash Mauro,
Yes.
Mauro.
I have an author page where I list all my interviews and excerpts, and I'll be listing my personal appearances too.
Oh, very good. Very, very good. Well, it's definitely been a pleasure, and I can't wait to dig into the book. I'm still waiting for my copy, but
Oh
it's on
gosh.
its way.
Oh gosh.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We will see you all next week. We thank you very much, and we love you very, very much. Have a great week,
Thank you.
everybody.